If you are dealing with a narcissist, the first and most important thing to understand is that they are not approaching the relationship the way you are. You may enter connections believing that they are built on honesty, mutual respect, emotional support, and a willingness to understand each other. This mindset allows genuine relationships to grow because it is based on cooperation. However, a narcissist often operates from an entirely different foundation. Their focus is not on creating balance or harmony. Their focus is on maintaining control, gaining admiration, protecting their image, and making sure they remain in a position of power. Their interactions are often shaped around what they can receive rather than what they can build together. A narcissist's priority in any conversation is usually to protect their own sense of superiority and control the way others perceive them. If changing the truth helps them maintain their image, they will manipulate the facts. If causing you to question your own memories and judgment gives them an advantage, they will use tactics like gaslighting without hesitation. If weakening your confidence makes you easier to influence, they may intentionally create situations where you begin doubting yourself. This is what makes these interactions so emotionally damaging. Many people believe that if they simply show enough kindness, patience, understanding, or communicate their feelings more clearly, the narcissist will eventually recognize their mistakes and change. Unfortunately, this belief often keeps people trapped in a painful cycle. A narcissist usually does not respond to reason, emotional explanations, or appeals to fairness in the way a healthy person would. They often change only when their behavior creates consequences they can no longer ignore. If you fail to recognize this reality, you may find yourself constantly trying to explain, prove, and defend yourself while becoming more exhausted emotionally. The first step toward protecting yourself is learning to observe patterns instead of being influenced by promises. Narcissists can be extremely skilled at saying exactly what someone wants to hear. They may promise improvement, express temporary regret, or present themselves as the victim to gain sympathy and keep you emotionally connected. The real question you need to ask is not what they say during emotional moments, but what their behavior repeatedly shows you over time. Words can create confusion, but consistent actions reveal reality. If someone repeatedly lies, manipulates situations, avoids responsibility, or treats you with disrespect, that pattern carries more truth than any apology or promise they offer. One of the biggest mistakes people make with narcissists is focusing on their explanations instead of paying attention to their repeated behavior. When you begin judging the situation through actions rather than words, the illusion starts to disappear and you become much harder to manipulate. Narcissists often rely on specific psychological strategies to maintain control, and one of the most damaging is gaslighting. Gaslighting slowly causes a person to lose confidence in their own perception of reality. A narcissist may deny things they clearly said, reject evidence placed in front of them, or rewrite past events until you start questioning whether your own memory can be trusted. Over time, you may find yourself apologizing for situations you did not create, or defending yourself against accusations that were never true. The more time and energy you spend trying to convince them of your reality, the more power you unintentionally give them because you are now responding to their version of events instead of standing firmly in your own truth. Another powerful tactic narcissists use is intermittent reinforcement. This happens when they create a confusing pattern of affection followed by coldness, kindness followed by cruelty, or closeness followed by emotional distance. This unpredictable cycle can become extremely difficult to break because the positive moments feel like rewards after periods of pain. If someone treated you badly all the time, you would eventually recognize the pattern and walk away. But when moments of love, attention, and validation appear occasionally, your mind starts focusing on getting those moments back. You may begin believing that if you say the right thing, act differently, or try harder, the relationship will finally become consistent. In reality, those rare moments of warmth can become part of the control cycle. This creates an unhealthy attachment where you are no longer staying because the relationship is emotionally fulfilling, but because you are chasing the version of the person they occasionally show you. You become attached to the hope of who they could be, rather than the reality of how they consistently behave. Another common tactic is projection, where the narcissist places their own flaws and behaviors onto you. If they are dishonest, they may accuse you of lying. If they are emotionally unstable, they may claim that you are the irrational one. If they refuse accountability, they may make you feel responsible for every problem. This allows them to avoid looking at themselves while keeping you distracted by defending your character. Understanding narcissistic behavior is not about becoming suspicious of everyone or losing your ability to trust. It is about gaining awareness and seeing situations clearly without allowing emotions or false hope to hide the truth. Once you understand the patterns, you stop participating in the same cycle that keeps you powerless. When you stop reacting the way they expect, their ability to control your emotions begins to weaken. The goal is not to defeat the narcissist. The goal is to stop allowing their behavior to determine how you see yourself. The moment you accept someone for who they consistently show themselves to be, rather than who you wish they would become, you regain your own power. One of the most painful traps people experience with a narcissist is the constant search for their approval. This does not always appear obvious. It is not only about trying to impress them or constantly seeking compliments. Sometimes it happens in small, almost invisible ways. You may start changing how you speak to avoid criticism, adjusting your needs to prevent conflict, or working harder and harder just to receive a small amount of appreciation from them. You may find yourself hoping that one day they will finally acknowledge your effort and treat you with the respect you have always deserved. This trap is so powerful because human beings naturally desire connection, acceptance, and recognition from the people they care about. When we invest time, love, and energy into a relationship, we naturally expect those efforts to matter. The hope that many people hold is that if they can just explain themselves clearly enough, prove their loyalty, demonstrate their good intentions, and remain patient long enough, the narcissist will eventually recognize their effort and change. They believe that one day the narcissist will finally understand their value and treat them differently. But that moment often never comes. The reason is because narcissists do not approach relationships through the same principle of mutual effort and appreciation. They do not always view your sacrifices as evidence that you deserve more respect. Instead, they may interpret your willingness to keep trying as proof that they still have influence over you. Every time you reshape yourself to avoid their criticism, you reinforce the idea that they have power over your emotions and choices. The more you chase their approval, the more control you unknowingly give away. When you constantly wait for their validation before feeling confident in yourself, you allow them to become the judge of your worth. You may believe there is a perfect combination of words, actions, or patience that will finally make them understand your value. But this search can become endless. With a narcissist, the standard often changes the moment you meet it. Just when you believe you have finally done enough, another expectation appears, another complaint emerges, and another reason is created for why you are still not enough. The important realization is understanding that this is not a reflection of your value. Their inability to appreciate and respect you comes from their own unresolved psychological patterns, not from any lack within you. A narcissist often carries a fragile sense of self that depends heavily on maintaining an image of superiority. Beneath the confidence they display, there can be a deep fear of being exposed, criticized, or proven wrong. Accepting responsibility would force them to confront parts of themselves they are trying to avoid. Truly appreciating another person would require them to step away from control and allow someone else's needs and feelings to matter equally. Because of this, they may rely on behaviors like manipulation, minimizing others, or taking emotional energy from people around them to protect their own self-image. Once you understand this dynamic, the solution becomes much clearer. The focus shifts away from changing them and toward protecting yourself through emotional, mental, and, when possible, physical distance. The first major step is to stop searching for their approval in any form. This does not mean becoming cruel, aggressive, or trying to hurt them back. It simply means removing yourself from the emotional battlefield they create. In everyday situations, this means learning to stop constantly defending yourself. Narcissists often thrive during arguments because conflict gives them an opportunity to redirect the conversation, challenge your reality, and keep you focused on proving yourself. The moment you start endlessly explaining your choices, you have already entered a conversation where they control the rules. You are no longer standing in your own truth. You are responding to their version of events. Stop giving long explanations to someone who is only collecting your words to use against you later. This also means accepting that you may never receive the closure you are hoping for. This can be one of the hardest lessons because most people naturally want resolution. They want the narcissist to admit what they did, acknowledge the pain they caused, offer a sincere apology, and finally provide the fairness they have been waiting for. But continuing to chase that moment can keep you emotionally attached to the very person who hurt you. Real closure often comes from within. It comes from accepting that you do not need their confession to validate your experience. You do not need their agreement to know what happened. You do not need their recognition to know that your feelings and your worth are real. The freedom begins when you decide that their acknowledgement is no longer required for your healing. One of the most important changes you can make is redefining where your validation comes from. If you have spent years adjusting yourself around someone who was never willing to truly appreciate you, it becomes necessary to take your power back. Your value was never something another person could create or remove. It was never dependent on whether a narcissist recognized it. Your worth exists independently of their opinions, criticism, or approval. The moment you stop trying to convince them to see your value and start recognizing it yourself, their influence begins to weaken. The strongest response to a narcissist is not revenge, anger, or proving them wrong. The strongest response is becoming so secure in yourself that you no longer need them to confirm who you are. One of the biggest mistakes people make with narcissists is assuming that normal relationship rules will protect them. They believe that if they remain fair, calm, logical, and understanding, the other person will eventually respond in the same way. They assume that kindness will create kindness, honesty will create honesty, and patience will eventually lead to mutual respect. But this belief is built on the assumption that the narcissist is seeking the same things they are seeking. A healthy person usually enters disagreements, hoping to find understanding, solve problems, and reach some form of peace. They believe that if both people communicate honestly, the truth can be discovered. But a narcissist often approaches conflict differently. Their focus is not always on finding common ground. Their focus can be on maintaining control and being the person who feels like they have won. This is why constantly trying to be the more patient, more reasonable, or more understanding person rarely creates the breakthrough you hope for. Your willingness to continue explaining, forgiving, and engaging does not always appear as strength to a narcissist. They may see it as an opportunity. They may interpret your continued emotional investment as proof that they still have access to your thoughts, feelings, and decisions. Even when you believe you are simply trying to fix the situation, they may see your reactions as confirmation that their methods are still working. The key change is learning to stop responding in predictable ways. When you stop giving them the emotional reactions they are trying to create, you begin removing the fuel that keeps the cycle alive. Narcissists often depend on external sources to maintain their sense of importance. They may seek attention, emotional reactions, admiration, or conflict because these things temporarily reinforce their self-image. This is why some narcissists create unnecessary tension, provoke arguments, or push emotional buttons. The conflict itself becomes a way to keep another person connected and focused on them. If you want to reduce their influence, one of the most powerful skills you can develop is emotional detachment. Emotional detachment does not mean becoming cold or pretending you have no feelings. It means learning how to recognize when someone is intentionally trying to pull you into guilt, anger, fear, or endless explanations. It means understanding that every emotional trap does not require your participation. When you can remain calm and grounded despite their attempts to provoke you, you take back control over the one thing they wanted most, your emotional energy. This is where the idea of the gray rock method becomes extremely important. Gray rocking is a psychological approach where you intentionally become less emotionally reactive, less engaging, and less interesting to someone who is trying to provoke you. Narcissists often gain power from emotional responses, whether they trigger anger, sadness, frustration, fear, or even intense affection. Your reaction can become a source of control for them. They feel powerful when they can influence your emotional state, but when you stop giving them the dramatic response they are looking for, their ability to manipulate the situation begins to weaken. When there is no emotional reward, the behavior often loses its purpose. They may become frustrated, lose interest, or search for another source of attention. However, practicing this level of emotional control is not easy. It requires a great amount of self-awareness and discipline. It is difficult to sit in front of someone who is intentionally pushing your buttons and choose not to respond emotionally. It is difficult to hear unfair accusations and resist the natural urge to defend yourself. It is difficult to watch someone distort events, damage your reputation, or completely misunderstand your intentions and simply refuse to enter the argument. But this restraint is necessary because every time you engage in the same cycle, every time you fight to prove your innocence, and every time you try to convince someone who is not interested in understanding you, you continue feeding the dynamic that is draining you. True emotional detachment is the ability to remind yourself that you do not need to earn validation from someone committed to misunderstanding you. You do not need to correct every false statement they make. You do not need to prove your goodness to someone who has already decided to see you through a distorted lens. When you reach this level of inner stability, you become much harder to control because a narcissist cannot easily manipulate someone who no longer reacts according to their expectations. The strongest response is not always anger, confrontation, or trying to expose them. Sometimes the most powerful response is complete emotional neutrality. When they realize they can no longer pull you into their chaos, they lose the influence they once had. That is when you begin taking your freedom back. One of the biggest dangers of being involved with a narcissist is becoming trapped in the endless cycle of conflict they create. You may convince yourself that if you can just explain your perspective clearly enough, prove your point strongly enough, or make them finally understand how their behavior affected you, everything will be resolved. But this belief often keeps you stuck. A narcissist usually does not enter an argument with the same intention as someone who genuinely wants to solve a problem. The purpose is often not understanding, accountability, or finding a fair solution. The purpose is maintaining control, keeping you emotionally engaged, and ensuring that you continue responding to them. Think about how these situations often unfold. You bring up a real concern. Maybe they said something hurtful, behaved dishonestly, or treated you unfairly. In a healthy interaction, even if the other person disagrees, they would still attempt to understand your perspective and have a sincere conversation. A narcissist, however, may respond differently. They may avoid the original issue, shift responsibility onto you, bring up something unrelated from the past, twist your words, or suddenly make you the focus of the problem. Before you realize what happened, the conversation has completely changed. Instead of discussing their actions, you are now defending your personality, your intentions, and your character. This is exactly where they gain an advantage. Once the conversation shifts into you trying to prove that you are not the problem, the original issue disappears. You are no longer holding them accountable. You are now trying to convince them that you deserve basic respect. The entire situation becomes a courtroom where you are forced to defend yourself while they avoid examining their own behavior. This is why these arguments can feel so exhausting. They are not designed to create understanding. They are designed to keep you emotionally occupied and distracted from the real issue. The way out of this pattern is learning how to disengage. This means refusing to participate in conversations that are created only to drain you. It means stopping the endless explanations, stopping the need to win every argument, and stopping the belief that the perfect words will suddenly change their perspective. This does not mean allowing someone to disrespect you or accepting harmful treatment. It does not mean staying silent when your boundaries are crossed. It means recognizing when a conversation has become a trap and choosing not to step into it. Boundaries are what protect you from being pulled back into the same cycle. A narcissist may test your boundaries because they want to know whether your limits are real or just statements. If you say, "I will not continue this conversation if I am being insulted," they may push harder to see if you will eventually give in. If you say, "I will not participate in arguments that become disrespectful," they may intentionally provoke you until you break your own rule. Their goal is often to prove that they can still influence your behavior. That is why boundaries only work when they are followed by consistent action. If you decide to end a conversation, you have to actually end it. If you decide that disrespect is unacceptable, you have to stop engaging when disrespect appears. If you decide you are no longer going to explain yourself repeatedly, you have to honor that decision. The moment a narcissist realizes that their usual methods no longer create the reaction they want, their sense of control begins to weaken. You are no longer responding like the person they expected you to be. You are no longer easily pulled into their emotional storms. The hardest part of maintaining boundaries is learning to tolerate the discomfort that comes with them. You may feel a powerful urge to correct every lie they tell about you. You may feel the need to defend yourself when they twist the truth. You may want them to finally admit what happened and recognize the pain they caused. But part of reclaiming your peace is accepting that some people will not acknowledge reality because they choose not to. Your self-respect cannot depend on their agreement. Your integrity cannot depend on their approval. Your peace belongs to you, and it does not require permission from anyone else. A narcissist's influence depends on your willingness to keep engaging in unnecessary battles, trying to convince them, and hoping that one more explanation will finally make them understand. The real power comes from learning when to walk away, when to stop responding, and when to choose your own peace over the temporary satisfaction of winning an argument. Because the greatest victory is not making a narcissist admit they were wrong. The greatest victory is reaching a point where their approval no longer determines how you feel about yourself. When you no longer need them to validate your perspective, your worth, or your reality, they lose access to the part of you they once controlled. One of the hardest truths about dealing with a narcissist is accepting that they will not respect boundaries simply because you explain them clearly. Boundaries are not created through endless conversations, repeated warnings, or hoping someone suddenly develops self-awareness. Boundaries only become real when they are supported by action. A healthy person may not always agree with your limits, but they can understand that you have the right to create them. A narcissist often sees boundaries differently. They may view them as a challenge, a restriction, or something they need to test until they discover how far they can push you. This is why weak or inconsistent boundaries often fail. If you tell a narcissist that something is unacceptable, but continue allowing the same behavior, they learn that your words do not carry consequences. They learn that enough pressure, guilt, emotional manipulation, or persistence can eventually make you surrender. Once they realize your limits can be negotiated, they may continue testing them again and again. Genuine boundaries require consistency. They require you to decide what you will accept and then follow through when that line is crossed. Without action, a boundary is only a request, and narcissists often do not respond to requests that interfere with their control. Enforcing boundaries can look different depending on the situation. Sometimes it means ending a conversation when disrespect begins. Sometimes it means removing yourself from a harmful environment. A narcissist often does not process mistakes and harm in the same way a self-reflective person does. Instead of honestly examining their actions, they may protect themselves through denial, blame shifting, or rewriting events. If changing the story allows them to avoid accountability, they may do exactly that. They may present themselves as the victim, make you the person at fault, or create a completely different version of what happened. If you are not careful, you can spend years trying to get someone to acknowledge a truth they are actively avoiding. At some point, you have to make a choice. You can continue chasing an apology that may never come, replaying old conversations and imagining how things could have gone differently. Or you can decide that your healing does not require their participation. This is difficult because humans naturally search for resolution. We want fairness. We want acknowledgement. We want the person who hurt us to understand the impact of their actions. But sometimes the closure we desire from another person is something we must create for ourselves. Taking back your power means reclaiming your own story. It means no longer waiting for the narcissist to give you permission to move forward. It means accepting that some people may never understand the damage they caused and choosing to heal anyway. Their inability to recognize your pain does not make your pain less real. Their refusal to validate your experience does not erase what happened. Your recovery does not depend on their agreement. As long as you are waiting for their acknowledgement, they still have influence over your emotional state. As long as you are hoping for them to finally understand, they still occupy space in your mind. But when you stop needing their approval, their explanation, or their version of reality, something shifts. You become free from the need to defend yourself. You stop chasing answers from someone unwilling to provide them. You stop giving them the power to decide when you are allowed to heal. The greatest form of freedom after dealing with a narcissist is not exposing them, defeating them, or forcing them to admit what they did. It is building a life where their influence no longer exists. It is becoming so grounded in yourself that they become nothing more than a chapter from your past. Not because what happened was acceptable, but because you chose not to carry the weight of it forever. The ultimate victory is not making them regret losing you. The ultimate victory is creating a life so peaceful, strong, and fulfilling that you no longer need them to recognize your value.